Bruce Willis entered the Last Week Tonight studio with that unmistakable walk, confident yet unassuming, the gait of a man who had nothing left to prove. The audience rose to their feet instantly, their applause thunderous and sustained, a celebration not just of the cinematic icon before them, but of what his presence here signified. It had been nearly 2 years since his family announced his retirement due to aphasia, later diagnosed as frontotemporal dementia. No one expected to see Bruce Willis on television again, yet here he was. John Oliver, normally the picture of sardonic composure, looked visibly moved as he welcomed his unexpected guest. The studio lights caught the slight glisten in his eyes as the applause continued far longer than the usual celebrity welcome. This wasn't just another interview. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Thank you for that," Willis said when the applause finally subsided, his voice stronger and clearer than anyone anticipated. "That means more than you know." The HBO studio in New York hummed with a rare energy. Production staff watched from the wings, phones and clipboards forgotten in their hands. Audience members sat forward in their seats, aware they were present for something historic. Last Week Tonight had never featured an interview like this. The show's format typically focused on Oliver's deep dives into complex issues, not celebrity conversations. But some moments transcend format. Some stories demand to be told. "Bruce, I have to say, having you here is genuinely the greatest honor we've had on this show," Oliver began, the usual ironic edge absent from his voice. "And I think everyone is wondering the same thing. How are you doing?" It was the simplest question, the most obvious one, yet it hung in the air with uncommon weight. Willis smiled, that familiar half-smile that had graced movie screens for 4 decades, and considered the question with careful deliberation. "That's a complicated answer, John," he said finally. "Physically, I have good days and challenging days. The medical terms and diagnoses you've probably heard about are accurate, but they're also just words, labels trying to describe something much more complex." He shifted slightly in his chair, gathering his thoughts with a patience that seemed new to him, a thoughtfulness born of necessity. "What the medical descriptions don't capture is what it feels like from the inside. How strange it is to be Bruce Willis and sometimes struggle to find once effortless words. How frustrating it can be to know exactly what you want to say, but feel the connection between thought and speech fraying at the edges." The studio was completely silent now, the audience collectively holding their breath as Willis continued. "But I'm here today because I've realized something important. Silence, while easier in many ways, isn't the answer. Not for me, and not for the millions of people facing similar challenges." Oliver nodded, allowing Willis the space to continue at his own pace, recognizing the courage this appearance required. "When my family announced my health, we were flooded with support, which was beautiful and moving. But among those messages were notes from people facing similar diagnoses who felt invisible, felt that cognitive conditions are something our culture pushes into the shadows." Willis leaned forward slightly, his famous blue eyes clear and focused. "I've spent my career playing men of action, characters who solve problems with decisive movement, heroes who know exactly what to say at the crucial moment. The irony of finding myself in a situation where communication itself becomes the challenge, that's not lost on me." A soft ripple of understanding moved through the audience. The contrast between Willis's iconic film persona and his current reality created a powerful tension that needed no explanation. "What made you decide to come on television again?" Oliver asked gently. "Specifically on this show, which, let's be honest, isn't exactly known for heartwarming celebrity moments." Willis laughed genuinely, the sound warming the studio. "That's exactly why I chose this show, John. Last Week Tonight isn't about surface-level conversations or carefully managed public images. You dig beneath the obvious, you take on complicated subjects that others avoid. And right now, I needed a place for a real conversation, not a polished performance." He paused, gathering his thoughts again, the slight delay a visible reminder of his condition. "Also, you've always been kind about my work, even the films that probably didn't deserve it." The audience laughed warmly, appreciating this glimpse of Willis's legendary dry humor. Oliver smiled, visibly touched by the unexpected compliment. "Die Hard is a Christmas movie, and I will die on that hill," Oliver quipped, referencing a long-running debate about Willis's most famous film. "It is. Willis nodded with mock seriousness. "But we're not here to settle that debate once and for all." His expression shifted then, returning to the deeper current of their conversation. "I'm here because about 6 months ago, I received a letter that changed something for me. It was from a 52-year-old former firefighter in Michigan who was diagnosed with the same condition I have. He wrote about how isolated he felt, how he'd gone from being someone people relied on in crisis to someone people didn't quite know how to talk to anymore." Willis's voice remained steady, but the emotion behind his words was palpable. "He said something that hit me hard. He wrote, 'I didn't lose my humanity when I lost some of my words. But sometimes it feels like the world sees the condition first and the person second.' And that resonated with me deeply." A camera caught a woman in the audience wiping tears from her eyes, her expression reflecting what many were feeling. "I realized I had a choice," Willis continued. "I could remain private, which would have been easier in many ways. Or I could acknowledge that being visible, being public about this journey might help change how we talk about cognitive health in this country." Oliver nodded, unusually subdued. "That's an incredibly generous perspective, especially given how protective you've always been of your private life." "It's not entirely altruistic," Willis admitted. "There's freedom in stepping into the light, in refusing to be defined by silence or shame. And I've spent enough time being the Bruce Willis to know that public perception is never the complete picture anyway." He smiled again, that recognizable expression that had launched 1,000 action films. "Besides, I've faced terrorists in Nakatomi Plaza, asteroids hurtling toward Earth, and Samuel L. Jackson on a bad day. This is just another challenge." The audience laughed and applauded, appreciating Willis's ability to reference his film legacy with self-awareness and humor. "Has this experience changed how you look back on your career?" Oliver asked when the laughter subsided. "Particularly those iconic roles that demanded so much intensity and physicality?" Willis considered this thoughtfully. "It's given me a new appreciation for certain aspects," he said after a moment. "The parts of my work I'm most proud of were never about the action sequences or the explosions. Though those were fun, don't get me wrong, they were about the human moments, vulnerability, connection, resilience in the face of impossible odds." He gestured expressively, seeming to find his rhythm now. "Take John McClane. People remember the action, the iconic lines. But what made that character connect wasn't the heroics, it was his humanity. He was afraid, he was vulnerable, he got hurt, he missed his wife. He was just a guy trying his best in an impossible situation." The parallel to Willis's current circumstances hung unspoken but evident to everyone. "So yes, looking back through the lens of my current experience, I appreciate those human elements even more. The moments between the action, the quiet scenes that showed characters struggling, adapting, finding strength they didn't know they had." Oliver leaned forward, genuinely engaged beyond any hosting duties. "You've had one of the most successful careers in Hollywood history. Is there anything you wish people understood better about that journey?" Willis's expression grew reflective, a depth there that many of his action roles hadn't allowed him to display. "I think people sometimes have the impression that careers like mine follow a master plan, that there's a strategy behind every choice. The reality is messier and more human. There were films I fought hard for that didn't connect with audiences. There were projects I did for a paycheck when I needed to provide for my family. There were decisions made based on exhaustion or insecurity, or simply not knowing what else to do." He smiled slightly. "And in between all that, there were moments of perfect creative alignment, where everything came together in ways you could never plan. Those are the moments you live for as an actor." The audience listened with rapt attention, many nodding in recognition of this more nuanced picture of artistic life. "What I wish people understood," Willis continued, "is that behind the movie posters and premieres, we're all just figuring it out as we go. Hollywood creates this illusion of certainty, of people who have it all figured out, but that's just another special effect." Oliver nodded thoughtfully. "That perspective seems particularly relevant to what you're going through now." "Exactly," Willis agreed, "because that's the human condition, isn't it? None of us know what's coming. We're all improvising, adapting to plot twists we never saw coming. My current situation is just a more visible version of what everyone faces in different ways." A ripple of recognition moved through the audience, the universal truth landing with quiet power. "There's something I've never shared publicly before," Willis said after a moment, his voice taking on a new quality that made the audience lean forward even further. "Something that feels important to say now, in this context." Oliver nodded encouragingly, creating space for whatever Willis wanted to share. "For most of my career, I struggled with severe social anxiety. The Bruce Willis people think they know. The confident, quippy guy comfortable in the spotlight, that was a character too, in many ways." Murmurs of surprise moved through the studio. This revelation contradicted the public image Willis had maintained for decades. Doing talk shows, red carpets, even some days on set. They were physically painful experiences for me. My heart would race, my thoughts would scatter. There were times I was physically ill before public appearances. He gestured slightly, acknowledging the irony. "It's strange, right? The action star is afraid of a room full of people, but that's the reality so many of us live with. These invisible struggles happening beneath the surface while we maintain the appearance of having it all together." Oliver looked genuinely surprised. "I don't think anyone would have guessed that about you. You always seemed so effortlessly in control in public situations." "That's the point," Willis nodded. "We're all performing versions of ourselves, especially in public spaces. The gap between perception and reality exists for everyone." He leaned forward slightly, his expression intensifying. "And that's connected to why I'm here today. This condition I'm living with now, it strips away your ability to maintain that performance. It forces an authenticity upon you that's both terrifying and, in some strange way, liberating." The audience was completely still, collectively witnessing something powerful unfolding before them. When you can't rely on the quick comeback, the perfect phrase, the social mask we all wear to some degree, you're left with something more essential, something more true. His eyes, still strikingly blue and alert, scanned the audience briefly. "I'm not saying this is easy. There are days I rage against this condition, days I'd give anything to step back into who I was before, but there are also moments of unexpected grace, of connections more authentic than anything I experienced in 40 years of fame." The emotion in the studio was palpable now, a collective recognition of something profound being shared. "My daughters visited recently," Willis continued, his voice softening at the mention of his family. "We were sitting together, not doing anything special. I was having a difficult day with words and feeling frustrated with myself, and my youngest daughter just took my hand and said, 'It's okay, Dad. We don't need words. We know you.'" He paused, visibly moved by the memory. That moment contained more truth than any film premiere, any magazine cover, any carefully crafted interview I've ever done. Just simple presence, simple connection, being instead of performing. A camera caught several audience members wiping away tears, moved by both the content of Willis's words and the evident effort it took to share them so eloquently. "That's what I hope people might take from this conversation," Willis said, his voice regaining its strength. "Not just about dementia or cognitive health, though that's important, but about the masks we all wear, the performances we maintain, and what might be possible if we found more ways to be authentically present with each other." The audience erupted into spontaneous applause, many rising to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to catch even Willis by surprise. The camera caught the emotion on his face, gratitude, vulnerability, and something like relief all mingled together. Oliver, visibly moved, waited for the applause to subside before speaking. "Bruce, I think I can safely say this is the most meaningful conversation we've ever had on this show. Thank you for trusting us with your story." Willis nodded, acknowledging the moment with characteristic understated grace. "Before we end, is there anything else you want to share with people who might be facing similar challenges, either themselves or with loved ones?" Willis considered this final question carefully. "I would say this. The human story doesn't follow a Hollywood script. There are no guaranteed happy endings, no perfectly tied resolution where everything makes sense. But there is beauty in the messy middle, in the adaptation, in the moments of connection that happen when we stop performing and start being present." He looked directly into the camera now, seemingly addressing viewers at home. "And for those specifically dealing with dementia or similar conditions, either personally or supporting someone who is, I want you to know you're not invisible. Your humanity doesn't diminish with your cognitive capacity. Your worth isn't measured by your productivity or your perfect recall or your flawless speech." His voice grew stronger, more assured. We are more than our conditions. We are more than our limitations. We are worthy of dignity, of inclusion, of being seen as complete human beings even when parts of us are changing. The studio fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. "Thank you for seeing me today," Willis concluded simply. Not just Bruce Willis the actor, but Bruce Willis the person, in progress, imperfect, still here. The audience rose once more in a standing ovation that continued long after Oliver announced they needed to break for a commercial. The camera caught Oliver embracing Willis, both men visibly moved by what had transpired. As the show cut to a commercial, the energy in the studio remained electric. Audience members turned to each other, many in tears, processing what they had just witnessed. Production staff exchanged glances of amazement, aware they had been part of something historic. Within hours of airing, clips of the interview spread across social media platforms at unprecedented speed. But unlike the typical viral content that flares and fades, this conversation seemed to deepen in impact as it spread. Neurologists and dementia care specialists praised Willis's articulation of the lived experience of cognitive change. Mental health advocates highlighted his revelations about social anxiety. Film critics revisited his body of work with a new appreciation for the humanity he had brought to even his most action-oriented roles. What resonated most powerfully, however, were the responses from ordinary people affected by similar conditions. Comment sections filled with stories of recognition, of gratitude, of people feeling truly seen for the first time. "My father has been living with dementia for 3 years, and Bruce Willis just put into words what Dad hasn't been able to express," wrote one viewer. "We watched this together, and it was the first time I've seen Dad cry since his diagnosis, not from sadness but from relief at being understood." A retired teacher in Oregon shared, "I've been hiding my early symptoms from friends and colleagues out of shame. Watching someone I've admired my whole life speak so openly gives me the courage to stop hiding." The conversation expanded beyond celebrity culture or even cognitive health, touching on universal themes of vulnerability, authenticity, and human connection in a digital age often characterized by its superficiality. 3 days later, at a dementia research fundraiser in Chicago, Willis made an unannounced appearance, not as a speaker, but simply as a participant, sitting among families affected by various forms of dementia. No press was invited, and no photos were released. He simply showed up, listened, and connected. Presence over performance, just as he had described. A week after the interview aired, John Oliver addressed the overwhelming response on his show. "Last week, we were honored to have Bruce Willis as our guest for a conversation that resonated with many of you. The response has been unlike anything we've experienced in the history of this show." He paused, uncharacteristically serious. "What I think made that conversation so powerful wasn't just Bruce's openness about his specific condition, but the universal truth he illuminated about human vulnerability, about the gap between who we appear to be and who we are." Oliver adjusted his glasses, a familiar gesture made somehow more poignant in this context. In a media landscape designed to reward performance over authenticity, that kind of truth-telling is genuinely revolutionary. And while we'll be back to our regular format next week, probably yelling about infrastructure or something equally sexy, the audience laughed, recognizing the return of Oliver's signature sarcasm. "I hope we can carry forward something of the spirit of that conversation." In living rooms across America, viewers who had tuned in expecting Oliver's usual blend of comedy and outrage found themselves instead in thoughtful reflection about masks and authenticity, about the stories we tell versus the lives we live. A therapist in Seattle used clips from the interview to facilitate a group discussion about vulnerability and connection. A film studies professor at NYU revised her syllabus to include a special examination of Willis's work through the lens of his revelations. A support group for families affected by dementia in Dallas reported doubled attendance at their next meeting. The ripples continued outward, not in the dramatic, quantifiable ways that media outlets typically measure, but in the quiet, profound shifts that happen when truth disrupts expectation, when vulnerability replaces performance, and when genuine human connection breaks through the noise of a distracted culture. 6 months later, Willis made good on a promise he had made to Oliver off-camera. Working with neurologists and dementia advocacy organizations, he helped launch a national initiative focused on changing public perception of cognitive conditions. The campaign featured not celebrity endorsements or dramatic statistics, but simply honest conversations with people living with various forms of dementia, sharing their experiences in their own words, however those words came. The campaign's simple tagline echoed Willis's most powerful moment from the interview: "See the person, not the condition." What had begun as a surprising television appearance had evolved into something far more meaningful, a cultural touchstone, a reference point for conversations about cognitive health, vulnerability, about the humanity that remains even as certain capacities change. In an industry often defined by image and illusion, Willis had offered something radical in its simplicity: truth, unvarnished and unafraid. In doing so, he had written perhaps his most impactful role yet, not as an action hero saving the day with perfect timing and flawless delivery, but as a human being navigating imperfection with courage, grace, and unflinching honesty. If you found meaning in this story, if you or someone you love has faced invisible challenges, remember that authentic connection begins with vulnerable truth, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply being seen as you are. In the end, as Bruce Willis so powerfully reminded us, we are all more than our conditions, more than our limitations, more than the performances we maintain for the world. We are human beings, in progress, imperfect, and still here.